What is up, everyone? In today's video, I'm going to be doing a full card breakdown for the UFC pay-per-view this weekend. So UFC 305, giving my predictions on every single fight. Let me know your guys' thoughts on this card, who you're picking down below. But let's just dive right into it. Starting off here on the early prelims, we have Stewart Nicoll taking on Jesus Aguilar. So we have Nicoll making his UFC debut. He's undefeated, 8-0, 4 knockouts, 3 submissions. Primarily a grappler here, a guy who's getting his finishes either by sub or, by ground and pound. He hasn't faced great competition on the regional scene, but he's pretty much just rolled through everyone. So even though the competition hasn't been great, he really hasn't struggled with that lower level of competition. For Aguilar here, he's 2-1 in the UFC. He lost to Tatsuro Taira in his UFC debut. Really no shame in losing that matchup. Taira's undefeated, has really just climbed the ladder here in the UFC. Then he KO'd Shannon Ross very, very quickly. I think sub 20 seconds. But we know Shannon Ross, very, very chinny. Pretty awful chin, honestly. Just goes to sleep very easily. So not taking a ton from that matchup. And then he won a very close decision over Mateusz Mendoza. It's honestly just kind of tough for me to get excited about Aguilar here. He's just very physically limited. He's 5'4" with a 62-inch reach. He's not a super explosive athlete, and it's not his fault, right? Flyweight's the smallest weight class, but even though 125 is the smallest, he is still very undersized for that weight class. Nicoll's not that much larger. He's 5'5", but he should have a larger reach, even though it's not listed on Tapology. For Aguilar, 6 of his 10 wins are by sub, but also, not great competition, not the same level of competition as a guy like Stewart Nicoll. So even though both these guys have been finishers, they've also both proven to be pretty durable. So I'm going to go with Nicoll by decision. Even though, he doesn't have that UFC experience, I think he just has a little bit more upside here than Aguilar, so I am going to pick him to win this one by decision. In the next fight, we have Song Kenan taking on Ricky Glenn, and we have Song moving down to 155. A little bit surprised he's able to make this move down. He's 34 years old, and he didn't really look all that undersized up at 170, which is where he's been fighting most of his UFC career. He has lost 3 of his last 4, but the level of competition has been pretty high. Those losses were to Ian Gary, Max Griffin, and then Kevin Jousset, who looks like, a pretty interesting prospect at welterweight. For Ricky Glenn, he doesn't have a win in over 3 years. He actually KO'd Joaquin Silva and then went to a draw with Grant Dawson in 2021. So, that year, that's pretty high-level comp. Having a knockout win and a draw is pretty impressive. But since then, he has been knocked out in the first round in back-to-back fights. I'm going to lean towards Kenan Song here. It seems like Ricky Glenn's durability is fading. He looked very uncompetitive against Drew Dober in his last fight. And even though Drew Dober, very powerful guy, good fighter, he's someone where he is still hittable. You can look decent before you end up getting finished, like a guy like Bobby Green. That was not the case with that Ricky Glenn fight. Song Kenan has won 3 of his 5 UFC wins by knockout. He dropped a guy like Ian Gary, who's a very good striker. So I'm going to go with Kenan Song by knockout over Ricky Glenn. In the next fight, we have Tom Nolan taking on Alex Reyes, and Nolan is by far the biggest favorite on this card. I think he's up to minus 1,200 at this point, and it's not shocking. He's a massive lightweight, 6'3", 73-inch reach. His last 5 wins are by knockout. And then you look on the other side with Alex Reyes here, Dominic Reyes' brother. He honestly just doesn't seem like UFC quality. He was KO'd by Mike Perry in a little over a minute in his UFC debut. That was up at 170, now down at 155. But then he didn't fight for 6 years. He had a 6-year layoff, came back, got knocked out by Charlie Campbell in the first round, and there really just wasn't a second of that fight that looked competitive. He kind of just looked like prey for Charlie Campbell out there, and I'm kind of expecting a similar thing in this matchup. I will say, I would not feel comfortable as a betting man, betting Tom Nolan at minus 1,200. He is a little bit chinny. He got dropped in his last fight against an opponent who's not super high level, but I just don't know if Alex Reyes is going to be the guy who can capitalize on it. So I'm not saying I trust Nolan to be minus 1,200, but I definitely think he's going to get the win here. I'm going to go with Tom Nolan by round 1 knockout. Pivoting over to Jack Jenkins taking on Herbert Burns. It's good to see Jack Jenkins back in the octagon. He was coming off an arm injury against Chepe Mariscal in his last fight. He's a pretty fun striker with really nasty leg kicks, has broken multiple of his opponent's legs from those leg kicks, which is, insane. It's honestly just tough for me to have any confidence in Herbert Burns here. He hasn't won since 2020. He's lost 3 straight fights. He's been finished in all 3 of those losses. And it seems like he just has a tendency to wilt when he's forced to fight at a high pace. He kind of gets into these wars, these, high volume fights, and he just can't hold up. The durability's not there. The cardio doesn't seem to be there. So I think Jack Jenkins is going to push a pace. We've seen him do it in previous fights. I think he's going to chop the legs, and I think he's going to be able to get Herbert Burns out of there in the second round. I think he's just going to make him wilt like we've seen Burns do in his last few fights. So going with Jack Jenkins by round 2 knockout. Then we're going to have Casey O'Neill taking on Luana Santos, and O'Neill had a great start to her UFC run. She had 4 straight wins. 3 of those were finishes. Then she blows out her knee, returns, loses to Jennifer Maia in like a somewhat competitive fight, but she lost. And then she got beat up pretty badly by Ariana Lipski in her most recent fight. This is definitely a little bit of a step down in competition, but honestly not by much. Even though Santos isn't ranked, doesn't have a ton of UFC fights, she's looked legit so far in her UFC run, 3-0 in the UFC. She's coming off a submission win over Maria Agapova a month ago. So even though she's not a huge name, it seems like she's on that trajectory to eventually be like a ranked fighter in this women's flyweight division. I'm actually going to go with Luana Santos in this matchup. Once Casey O'Neill has hit that ranked level competition, her striking just hasn't really been good enough to win rounds on the feet, and then she also just hasn't been able to initiate her grappling, which I'd say is her strong suit, her wrestling, her submission game. She has not been able to get that going, and I think you're looking at, an opponent in Luana Santos where she can hold her own on the feet, also has very good jiu-jitsu, so I don't think Casey O'Neill has the edge in the grappling, and I just haven't seen enough out of her as a striker to pick her, to win rounds here against Luana Santos. So I think this one's probably going to stay on the feet. Both are obviously very capable grapplers. I think it's going to be competitive, could be somewhat close, would not be shocked if it was some sort of like close split decision, but I am going to go with Luana Santos by decision in this matchup. Then we have Josh Culibao taking on Ricardo Ramos, and both these guys are coming off of back-to-back losses. Ramos has lost both of his last 2 by guillotine, and then Culibao is coming off of back-to-back decision losses. I believe one of those was a split decision. I'd say within this matchup, I think Ramos is definitely the more dangerous fighter. He has 2 spinning back elbow KOs in the UFC. I think, he definitely has more finishing upside here. But he's also lost to pretty much every legit step up in competition that he's had in his UFC run. Josh Culibao definitely doesn't have the same finishing ability, but I think he's someone who can stay fairly competitive with most of the guys that are outside the top 15. I think as long as Culibao can avoid a flashy finish, I think he's going to be able to kind of use his unorthodox striking and take this one by decision. Shifting over to the heavyweight matchup here on the prelims, we have Junior Tafa taking on Valter Walker. Both these guys have brothers in the UFC, with Justin Tafa for Junior Tafa and then Johnny Walker for Valter Walker. This is a pretty clear striker versus grappler matchup. I think Junior Tafa definitely has the power and striking to just completely nuke Valter Walker. We saw him do it against Parker Porter. He can put dudes out. He's a very good striker, clearly very powerful, but then Walker also has the ability to just grind out fights, and Tafa really does not perform well in those matchups. Walker landed 4 takedowns, racked up 7 minutes of control time in his UFC debut, ended up losing a pretty close fight to Lucas Brzeski, which isn't exactly a great sign. Brzeski's had a pretty poor UFC career, but I think the fact that he was able to initiate his wrestling like that, with Tafa having little to no takedown defense and then pretty much 0 answers once he's on the ground, he really has struggled to get up or hasn't even really attempted to get up once he is taken down. I feel like if Walker's able to have the same success just in terms of the takedowns, I think he's going to have a much better chance of winning this matchup. So I'm going to go with Valter Walker by round 3 ground and pound. I think he's going to be able to wear out Junior Tafa, get him tired, and then I think he's going to find the finish in the final round here. But I also do acknowledge that this is very close on paper, and while I do think Walker could get that late round finish, I also think it's possible that, he might not even be able to land a takedown before he just gets hit by something hard from Junior Tafa and put out. So I am siding with Walker, but do think this one could go either way. Then we're going to have the Leech taking on Carlos Prates. And it's good to see the Leech back here, but the UFC is definitely not doing him any favors with this matchup. The last time we saw him was September of 2022, where there was that whole crazy fight week where it was supposed to be Khamzat Chimaev, Nate Diaz. Chimaev misses weight. They reshuffled the whole card. We ended up getting Nate Diaz, Tony Ferguson, Khamzat Chimaev, Kevin Holland. And then Li Jingliang definitely got the short end of the stick there because he weighed in at 170 to fight Tony Ferguson. He ended up having to accept a fight against Daniel Rodriguez, who weighed in at 180 to fight Kevin Holland. And he ends up, fighting very well. I think most people thought he won, that fight. The decision did not go his way, so he had to fight a bigger man. He didn't get to show off his suit at the press conference, and then the judges also did not give him the nod. Since then, he has been dealing with a spine injury, which not obviously something you want to mess around with here. Not a great sign that that's the injury he's been out for so long with. Then we look at Carlos Prates. He has had a great start to his UFC career. He had a round 2 knockout on the Contender Series. Then he had a nasty round 2 knockout in his UFC debut. And then another very flashy knockout with a round 1 knee to the body. I think it was the UFC Louisville card. So he has 17 finishes in his 19 wins. 14 of those are by knockout. This is likely going to be a striker versus striker matchup. And with the Leech's inactivity, how impressive Prates has looked, it's hard for me to pick against him here. And even though the Leech has never been knocked out in his UFC career, I think this might be the first for him. I'm going to go with Carlos Prates by knockout over Li Jingliang. Continuing on with the main card here, we have a heavyweight matchup between Tai Tuivasa and Jairzinho Rozenstruik, two guys that are likely going to go out, stand and bang with each other. Unfortunately, Tai Tuivasa has been on a very, very rough stretch. This is 4 straight losses. He's been finished in all 4. He was knocked out by Cyril Gane and Sergey Pavlovich. Both kind of, brutal knockouts, took a lot of damage. And then he was out-grappled and submitted by Volkov and Tybura. And the Volkov fight, he was also getting beat up pretty bad on the feet. Rozenstruik is coming off a pretty composed win over Shamil Gaziev. Obviously, Gaziev not the highest level of competition, but he was able to, to avoid some of the takedowns, didn't get controlled, and then ended up getting a corner retirement at the end of the 4th. It was not a super exciting fight, but since that Francis Ngannou knockout where he was undefeated heading into that one, it has been very, very up and down for Jairzinho Rozenstruik. He's been a win-1, lose-1 type of guy, and I think both these guys clearly have the ability to put the other one out. We've seen Rozenstruik get put out. We have seen Tai Tuivasa put out, and we know both these guys, have very heavy hands, definitely have elite knockout ability at the heavyweight division. I just think in this matchup, I'm going to lean with Rozenstruik. He's taken less damage throughout his career. I feel like he has to be a little bit more durable, and he's also had the more recent success. It's tough for me to back someone who's, been finished in 4 straight fights. So it's sad to see, I'd love to see a Tai Tuivasa shoey in Australia, but I'm going to go with Jairzinho Rozenstruik by round 1 knockout. I really would have wished that they, kind of eased up Tai Tuivasa's strength of schedule. Like when you're on a 3-fight losing streak to Cyril Gane, Sergey Pavlovich, Volkov, why are you giving him a bad stylistic matchup in Marcin Tybura? Like, let the dude fight outside the rankings. There are some heavyweights, Tai Tuivasa, Derek Lewis. I don't need to see them fighting these high-level guys, especially at this point in their careers. Let them just beat up on some random dudes, fighting outside the top 15. Let them go out there, have some fun striking matches. So even though this one is going to be a striking matchup, it's just not exactly the one that I want to see with Tai Tuivasa on a 4-fight losing streak. So as a fan, I hope Tai Tuivasa gets it done, but as someone who's picking a winner, I feel like you have to favor Jairzinho Rozenstruik here. Now pivoting over to Mateusz Gamrot taking on Dan Hooker, I kind of feel like this is strange matchmaking here from the UFC. It seems like Gamrot's someone who should be fighting up in the rankings. I think Dan Hooker definitely deserves to fight up, but I didn't really think he would get, this high profile of an opponent, at least in terms of ranking. But, here we are. We have the matchup at Gamrot taking on Dan Hooker. And when you look at Mateusz Gamrot, he has a pretty insane resume despite winning in very controversial ways. So he has decision wins over Arman Tsarukyan, which was very controversial. I personally thought Arman Tsarukyan won that one. He has a decision win over Jalen Turner, another one that's fairly controversial, one of those fights where Turner was landing the more damage. But Gamrot was racking up that control time. The judges end up favoring the control time for Gamrot. And then he has a win over RDA, but obviously this is not prime RDA at this point. And then he has a win over Rafael Fiziev, where Fiziev just blew out his knee in the fight. Not something that, Gamrot actually did to him. And Gamrot has this very unique ability where he can get clipped, and then he somehow tricks the judges into thinking he's shooting for a takedown. Like, he'll get pretty much dropped, but just instantly he turns it into a takedown and is able to, either control his opponent or just take him down and hold him down there. And I think that's definitely saved him in some of those close fights that I've talked about. Like, I think the Arman Tsarukyan fight, he got dropped by a spinning back fist, didn't really do anything, major to hurt Arman Tsarukyan, and he ended up winning the ground on at least one of the judges' scorecards. We obviously saw the same thing in the Jalen Turner fight. He's getting hurt, getting stunned, but still ending up, winning rounds with the judges. You definitely cannot deny his relentlessness. The dude will just shoot until he's able to get the takedown, rack up some control. And in his last 4 fights that have gone to decision, he has landed 25 total takedowns. So he's also having success. He's not necessarily racking up a ton of control time in all those matchups. Like, Arman was taken down but was able to scramble, get up, was able to control some of those other opponents. Hooker is coming off a very long layoff. He's been recovering from his fractured arm that he messed up in the Jalen Turner fight. And looking back at that Turner fight, a very impressive fight, an impressive performance from Dan Hooker. It wasn't looking great early on. He weathered the early storm, ended up hurting Jalen Turner pretty bad, winning a very, very fun decision there. When we look at Dan Hooker and his UFC career, he's historically struggled against very explosive fighters. We look back at his war with Dustin. He was going toe-to-toe with Dustin Poirier, someone that I think a lot of people would think is a much higher level fighter than a guy like Dan Hooker. Dustin's obviously very good, but I wouldn't say he's the most explosive fighter. On the other hand, we've seen him get nuked by a guy like Michael Chandler, who's crazy explosive, a guy like Arnold Allen, who I'd also say is very explosive. Obviously, his loss to Makhachev is just, Makhachev being the best in the world. But I wouldn't say that his opponent this weekend, Mateusz Gamrot, kind of fits into like that super explosive tier. Michael Chandler, Arnold Allen. Not saying that he's like a bad athlete by any means, but I just don't think he has that same explosiveness as those guys. I also think Dan Hooker has some of the weapons to kind of discourage and punish Mateusz Gamrot's shots, especially if he's going to be going in over and over again. Hooker's 6 feet tall, has a 75.5-inch reach. We saw him use the teep kicks very well in his recent win against Claudio Puelles, a guy who's trying to get him down, get his grappling going, and he really, shut all that down. Hurt him to the body multiple times, ended up finding the finish. We know Dan Hooker also has very good knees, and he also has like legit power. He's hurt Dustin Poirier on the feet, he's hurt Jalen Turner, he's knocked out Gilbert Burns, and Mateusz Gamrot also doesn't have the best chin. So I know Dan Hooker's the pretty heavy underdog in this matchup, and I could also see this one playing out where like Hooker hurts him on the feet, maybe gets a little bit overzealous, and then kind of like runs into a spot where he can get taken down. But I think he's going to be able to control the distance, and I think he's going to be able to do enough damage on the feet to kind of like overcome the control that Gamrot's probably going to have at some point. And then maybe he also finds a finish either with a knee, or a big shot on the feet, maybe a shot to the body. So I am going to go with Dan Hooker by decision. I think I also could be setting myself up for a fight that's very similar to the Jalen Turner one, but I'll go with Dan Hooker by decision. And then also, like, we've talked about how these fights have been very close, these very, competitive decisions. Maybe the fact that this one's in Australia, Hooker's going to have the crowd behind him. Maybe that ends up being the edge here that gives Dan Hooker the win. So I'm going to go with Dan Hooker by decision. Then shifting over to the co-main event, we have a very fun flyweight matchup. Kai Kara-France taking on Steve Erceg. Kai Kara-France is back after being out for over a year. He's coming off a very controversial loss to Amir Albazi. I thought that was a great performance for Kai Kara-France. I thought he won that fight. I did not agree with that decision, but obviously a very different stylistic matchup here against Steve Erceg. Erceg is coming off a very competitive title fight loss to Alexandre Pantoja. I think a lot of people were very impressed with him, even though he did lose that fight. And I think most are expecting a pure striking battle between these two, and I definitely think the majority of it is going to take place on the feet. Both guys who I think their preference would be to stay standing. And in a pure striking fight, I'm sure it's going to be competitive. I'd probably give the slight edge to Steve Erceg here. I think he's the more durable guy. Also, we've seen he does hit pretty hard. But I also think that between these two, I feel like Steve Erceg has the ability to mix in the grappling, mix in his own takedowns, just to kind of make Kai Kara-France work. I don't think that's the strategy that Kai Kara-France is going to employ here. And I'm not saying that Steve Erceg is going to be able to take him down, control him. Kai Kara-France showed great takedown defense against Elmir Albazi, but it's just giving him something to think about, kind of making him uncomfortable here. We know Kai Kara-France was mostly concerned about the takedowns from Elmir Albazi, having to be concerned about someone who's the same level, maybe even a higher level striker than you, and then also having to worry about being taken down. I think Steve Erceg, is going to win a decision here. Might be close, might be competitive, but I think he gets it done by decision and kind of keeps himself within the title picture here. And then we are finally at the main event here. Dricus du Plessis taking on Israel Adesanya, defending his middleweight title here. And I'm going to be honest, this fight just seems very, very tough to break down. I think the entire middleweight division is just in such a weird spot where it feels like I have no idea how good any of these top dudes are. Like, for so long, Israel Adesanya looked unbeatable. He was the clear top guy in the division. It was him at the top, and then you had Robert Whittaker, who, got knocked out in the first fight by Izzy, but then was very competitive in the second one. Whittaker had just been beating everyone that was not named Israel Adesanya. And then we see Izzy, go out in a fight where he's a massive favorite against Sean Strickland, and he gets completely outclassed. Like, it wasn't like he just got beat. He was completely embarrassed in that matchup. He was hurt badly in the first round. I think he only won one round. Sean Strickland was walking him down, talking to him, towards the end of the fight while he was beating him. Izzy looked rough in that fight. And then on the other hand, we had DDP, who had been racking up a lot of wins, was undefeated in the UFC, but he had looked pretty sloppy. It kind of seemed like, all right, once he gets to that upper echelon of the division, like, it's not going to be great. Someone's going to hurt him. Someone's going to clip him. He's going to look very human. And then he goes out and just puts on a masterclass against Robert Whittaker, where he is a massive underdog. And then he ends up taking the belt off of Sean in a very competitive fight, but he gets the edge. Like I said, I thought it was very close. Could have gone either way, but DDP gets the win. So if you're doing MMA math, you would say, well, all right, Sean beat Izzy, DDP beat Sean, DDP I think is going to beat Izzy here, but I don't think it's that simple. I feel like Sean Strickland definitely exposed a hole in Israel Adesanya's game. We've seen guys like Robert Whittaker try to get to Adesanya by blitzing him, trying to put the pressure on him in more like explosive ways where you're darting in and then getting out. That clearly didn't work because Izzy countered Whittaker very, very well and obviously knocked him out in the first fight. But what Sean Strickland did is he just applied constant pressure. He wasn't blitzing in and then, getting back out at range. He was just walking forward, and Izzy pretty much wilted in front of him, something we really had not seen before in an Israel Adesanya fight. And I do think that Dricus du Plessis has the skill set to replicate that game plan, while probably also being a more dangerous finisher than a guy like Sean Strickland. I mean, we literally saw DDP do what Strickland did to Izzy in the DDP Strickland fight, right? DDP was walking Strickland down, which is something you don't see super often for guys fighting against Sean Strickland. And so if he can do it to the guy that did it to Izzy, he can probably do it to Izzy also. I think the issue here is that DDP is definitely not as defensively responsible as a guy like Sean Strickland. And we also have the thing where DDP is not going to surprise anyone in this matchup, right? We saw him look great against Robert Whittaker. It seemed like him and his team kind of caught Whittaker off guard, did a great game plan. DDP looked much improved, and then he picks up the win against Sean Strickland. But DDP's team isn't going to be able to, kind of craft this game plan that's very similar to what Sean Strickland did and completely surprise Israel Adesanya, right? He had it happen to him. He's had a lot of time to adjust, and, he's been able to kind of fix some of those mistakes. So I think it's going to be competitive. I think you really could go either way. I'm going to end up going with Izzy by decision here. I feel like there are a lot of unknowns within this matchup, but you look at how impressive he was. He was coming off that great knockout win over Alex Pereira. I think he's going to make his adjustments. I don't think DDP is going to be able to, kind of catch him off guard. And I think Izzy is going to get the win by, I guess we'll go with decision. I also think he has the ability to put him out, but Dricus has been very durable, a little bit more defensively responsible in recent fights. So I'm going to go with Izzy by decision, but honestly, I'm just excited to see how this one plays out. I think middleweight's very interesting at this point. You just don't even know who the best dude in the world is. So I'm going with Izzy, and that's going to wrap it up for all my UFC 305 predictions. Let me know your guys' thoughts down below in the comment section. If you're going in a different direction with some of these picks, would love to hear it and would love to know why. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.